All right, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed your dinner and getting to know some of your table mates. They'll be your competitors tomorrow, but take an opportunity to exchange some ideas where you can. And as several of our speakers mentioned today, really that tomorrow is really more about learning as much as it is competing. So tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker. Tonight's speaker is well known in the information technologies community as someone who has a long reach and has made profound contributions to cybersecurity. Mr. Chris Wysopal is the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of Veracode, a leading provider of enterprise-class applications security. In 2008, he was named one of InfoWorld's top 25 CTOs and one of the 100 most influential people in IT by eWeek. Chris is one of the original vulnerability researchers and a member of Loft Heavy Industries. He has testified before Congress on government computer security and how software vulnerabilities can be discovered. He published his first advisory in 1996 on parameter tampering in Lotus Domino and has been trying to help people not repeat the same types of mistakes for the past 15 years. Chris is the author of The Art of Software Security Testing. And ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Chris Wysopal.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's see here. Thank you, Colonel Gray. I got to log in here. Had to leave the laptop secure, of course. Let's see if that works. Oh, my password's too hard. See if that works. There we go. Let's see here. Hopefully that'll work. There we go. So yeah, it's great to be here, and you've shown me such great hospitality here at VMI. So thank you for that, and thank you to Senator Warner for inviting me and having me come and speak here. Senator Warner's done a lot of great work in the federal government for seeing what the federal government's role should be in helping with cybersecurity, and I've been talking with him a bit about that for the last few years. But today, what I wanted to talk about was some of my roots coming from the hacker community back in the 90s, and how me and my compatriots at the Loft, how we used the hacker mindset and took it from something that you might think of as, the bad guy, and used our thinking to improve cybersecurity, and use that thinking to make doing cybersecurity better. So this here, is a picture of me when I testified at the Senate in 1998. If you can't tell which one is me, that's me there. My hair's a little bit different. And you probably can't read it, but on the placards are our hacker names. It says Wells Pond under me. It's got Mudge there in the middle. This guy's Kingpin. Maybe you can read my name. That's Space Rogue. And it was interesting that when we got invited by the Senate, we said, we'll only do this if we can testify under our hacker names. And they said, well, why? Why do you need to do that? Why can't you use your real names? And we said, well, we have day jobs, and we work in IT. And we might get fired if they find out that when we're not working, as a hobby, we're finding vulnerabilities in Microsoft Windows, and we're showing everyone how to exploit that. So we thought at the time it was risky to testify under our real names. We forgot that they have cameras there, and they took pictures, and some of these pictures ended up in the newspaper. So the jig was up when we got back to work in a couple days. So that was a lesson. That was a lesson in anonymity or pseudo-anonymity for me. But you know, the question is, you know, how did we get here? How did a bunch of guys in their 20s end up testifying about computer security with the Government Accounting Office and people from government think tanks? Why were we there? And the reason we were there is I like to say we made trouble. We got noticed. And we didn't commit any crimes. It wasn't that kind of trouble. But we did make people angry because we were challenging the status quo. We were finding vulnerabilities in their software, and we were publishing this information, which had never been done before. We were writing tools that could exploit those vulnerabilities and distributing them with the idea that you could use those tools to find vulnerabilities or detect if your system had the vulnerabilities. And vendors didn't like this, and businesses didn't like this at all. But it raised awareness to the fact that most software, when you bought it, was insecure. Or many businesses, when they had an online presence, were insecure. And there just wasn't any awareness about that at the time. And we got in the papers a few times, and we got the notice of, it was Senator Thompson at the time, and he wanted to have the adversarial viewpoint, the hacker viewpoint, presented when they were having a hearing on government security. So this was actually the first hearing on government security. It was in 1998. It was the first time the Government Accounting Office went and did an audit of all the different departments of government. You can imagine how bad the security was back then. But I want to give another example of what I mean by, you know, making trouble, because sometimes you have to make a point. A year later, after this, I was working at a nationwide ISP, and me, and it was actually Mudge there, the guy with the beautiful rock and roll hair. Oops, I went ahead there. This guy here. We were concerned that when auditors came onto we were supposed to defend the network, and we were concerned when auditors came onto the network, they were bringing insecure laptops, using insecure tools, and then they were taking our vulnerabilities and they were writing their reports on their laptops. And we knew they were going to go bring that laptop to another customer. So we had heard of this problem before. And we said, well, just telling them that they need to secure their laptops isn't going to work. So we said, well, what if we make a little bit of trouble for them? Then they'll get the message. So when our boss hired these third-party auditors to come in, we said, can we put in the contract that we have the right to assess their laptops? You know, blue team attacking the red team, essentially. Doesn't that make sense? And they said, yeah, we put it in the contract. Well, the guys in the field really didn't know that this was in the contract. And when we broke into their laptops, we found our report, and we found reports from all their other customers. And we said, hey, wait a minute, you're here to help us with our security, and you're actually putting us at risk by putting our vulnerability information on a laptop that you're taking to another customer's sites. So they got the message, and the next time they came, actually, their laptops were locked down. So sometimes it takes more than just requesting something or making someone aware of something. You have to do a demonstration. And that is a lot of what the hacker mindset brings to cybersecurity, is to take it out of this theoretical and actually demonstrate it, write the exploit, show what's possible. And I just think it's a lot easier to learn that way and to get people to take action. So this is back actually a little bit before my time, but I read this paper, and I look at this paper, and you probably think this is completely obvious now, but these guys, Dan Farmer and Weetzy Venema, wrote this paper, Improving Security of Your Site by Breaking into It. That's what we used to call a network, a site. And the idea was, and no one had thought of this before, security used to be you put in your firewall, you configure your systems, you patch your systems, and you're done. And they come up with the idea is every time a network gets compromised, let's figure out the root cause of that compromise, and then we'll add it to a laundry list of things to try. And then when we could go to another person's network, we can try all of these things and see if the network is secure. So this got the idea that you needed adversarial thinking to secure a network. And this was really the birth of penetration testing, came from this paper. The next thing that hackers really did was we made information security, I like to call it a participatory sport. It wasn't a static thing where you read a book and you configured your system. You actually tried to break things. You tried to find new vulnerabilities. You tried to use variations on vulnerabilities. And out of this was born the whole capture the flag concept. The first capture the flag was at the DEF CON Hacker Conference in 1996. A group of people got together and said, why don't we throw this contest up at DEF CON back in 96? And obviously, capture the flag events have grown greatly since then. The other things hackers like to do is build tools. And building tools to find an insecurity back in these dates here, 91, 95, 96, was actually a completely radical notion. It was so radical that people would get fired if they wrote these tools. You can see why we wanted to use our hacker names. So this guy, Alec Muffet, in 1991, was a Unix system administrator, and he was concerned about weak passwords. He was concerned that his users might be using guessable passwords. He says, what am I going to do to see if my users are using guessable passwords? I mean, I could put a keystroke logger on the system and record the password when they're logging in, but that seems insecure because now I'm going to have a clear text file with their password somewhere on all these different systems. What if instead I took the password file and then I tried to hash all the words in a dictionary and all the easy-to-guess passwords, and I compared them against the hashes, and then I would see whether one of those hashes matched a weak password. So back in 91, that was a radical notion. Of course, now password cracking is a pretty standard way to find weak passwords. But of course, it can be used by the bad guy, right, to find the password to then reuse in another system. So this is an example of one of the first tools that can be used to audit the security of a system and improve it, or be used by a bad guy. And so hackers created these tools that could be used either way. They could be used for good or bad. Up until that point, security professionals would never create a tool that could be used by the bad guy. It was just verboten. And so the idea of a tool like crack being used was actually thought just using the tool. Even if you were using it to secure a system, it was thought of that you must be up to no good. And this guy, Randall Schwartz, who worked for Intel, I think this was back in 93 or 94, he was assistant administrator for his system. And he learned about crack, and he wanted to make sure that none of the users of his systems had weak passwords. So he ran crack on the systems. Some other IT person found out that he was running crack, reported him to management at the company, and he got fired and charged with a felony. He didn't do anything with the passwords except try to get people to reset the ones that were weak. But the mere fact of running this tool was misunderstood at the time. Satan was a tool that was written by Dan Farmer and Weetzy Venema, the ones who wrote the paper securing your site by breaking into it. And their idea was, let's automate this process. Let's take all those checks that we wanted to do for vulnerabilities and configuration, and if patches were missing, and we'll automate it, and we'll make a script that will tie these all together, and we're going to release it on the internet so other people can secure their sites by finding all the vulnerabilities in it. Of course, This can be used by the bad guy to find the vulnerabilities in it. It could be used by the good guy to find them and patch it. But this was so controversial that Dan Farmer got fired from his job at Silicon Graphics, which was a Unix workstation company, just for the fact of releasing this tool. Not illegal, but the fact that it could be used by the bad guy was something that his company didn't want to have their name on. I think he probably could have come up with a better name than Satan, though, don't you think? That probably was a little bit of a negative in that situation. And then Netcat is a tool that you've probably heard of. It comes with most Unix distributions now. And that was a tool that really, it's very basic. All it does is pipe standard in and standard out through a network connection, right? Open the port, connect to it, send some information to the port, and read it on the other side. It's a very, very basic low-level tool. You know, it's like having a screwdriver. But the idea that attackers could take this tool and use it to attack systems made it so that a lot of antivirus companies, you know, would flag Netcat as malware. So a lot of these things were just misunderstood at the time. Oh, the thing to mention about Satan as the first network vulnerability scanner, that's now a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? Tenable went IPO'd as a public company. They make the Nessus, commercial version of Nessus. Their company is worth $2 to $3 billion. Rapid7 makes network vulnerability scanners worth $2 to $3 billion. But it took a good 10 years for the industry to wake up and realize that, you know, even if the tool could be used for bad, it's actually better to have these tools available to people securing systems. And then came things like BugTrack, a mailing list created by hackers to distribute vulnerability information and have discussions. Before BugTrack, there was really no way to discuss vulnerabilities anywhere. There was no official way to do it. What you were supposed to do before these security mailing lists popped up was you were supposed to, you know, if you found a vulnerability, you discovered one, you report it to the vendor or you report it to a clearinghouse like CERT. The problem was there was no coordinated vulnerability disclosure. It just went into a black hole, and you never knew if the vendor fixed it, if they did fix it, what release it was in. There was never a concept of a security bulletin. No one was holding the vendors accountable. You were supposed to be the good guy and report the information, but then the vendor could just not fix it or silently fix it or take years to fix it. And so the idea of lists like BugTrack was, let's start talking about these things out in the open, that these things actually exist out there. And we started doing it at the Loft for the vulnerabilities that we found. Eventually, the industry came around and said, you know what, guys, if you tell us about this stuff, before going public with it, we'll fix it, and we'll tell you when we fix it, and we'll even give you credit. But before that happened, which is a great thing, right? The vendors are taking action, they're fixing things, and they're letting you know where it's fixed. They were upset with the idea that hackers were putting their customers at risk. Of course, our argument was, you put your customers at risk because you are the ones who shipped the product with the vulnerability in it. We're not the only ones who can find the vulnerability. You know, we're not like special snowflakes. There's probably thousands of people who can do this. We're the ones who are talking about it. So a lot of misconceptions had to be broken down. And then, of course, DEF CON started in the early 90s, and, you know, Capture the Flag started there in 96. Became really popular towards the late 90s with government security people and corporate security practitioners. They started to come to DEF CON because they figured, I want to know what the hackers are talking about. That's going to help me secure my network. I want to learn about the tools that they're distributing. Maybe I can use those tools. And so the professional security side started attending hacker conferences. At DEF CON, it got to the point where there was a contest created called Spot the Fed. And the idea was that, if you were at the DoD or something like this, and you went there, you probably were trying to blend in, but it didn't really work very well with the short haircuts and wearing the golf shirt. And so the contest was if someone spotted you, they could call you up to stage at any talk and say, "I spotted the Fed," and you had to come up to the stage and either admit you were the Fed or not. And you both won a T-shirt. The person who spotted the Fed won a T-shirt that says, "I spotted the Fed," and the Fed won one that says, "I am the Fed." So that was probably a fun thing to bring back to the office, right, afterwards. But now we all know DEF CON is huge, and there's, I think, about 25,000 attendees at DEF CON now each year. And then hackers started to turn pro, right? And I have my own story about this, but I just want to mention some companies that wrote the first class of tools in certain categories were from the hacker community. So Chris Klaus founded Internet Security Systems, wrote the first network vulnerability scanner. The way he found out all the things to scan for, he went out to Pound Hack on IRC and asked hackers, what are the cool things that you're finding on systems? And he basically stitched those all together and made a network vulnerability scanner. SourceFire was started by Marty Resch, who created the IDS Snort, probably the most famous IDS. Arbor Networks was started by a guy named Doug Song, who's from the hacker group WooWoo, the first anti-DDoS product back in 2001 was created by him. And then he went on to found Duo after that, which is probably the most successful two-factor authentication company. I founded Veracode in 2006 with one of my Loft colleagues, Christian Ryu. He went by Dildog. And all the ways that people would look through code to try to audit code and find vulnerabilities in code, we basically automated that process with a technique called static analysis, and we do it on binaries, where we can take a binary and we can scan through that binary looking for vulnerabilities, and we sell it to software developers. So when software developers are writing their applications or their products or their websites, they can scan their code, find the vulnerabilities, and fix them before they put that, ship that product or put up that website. But then there's a lot of companies that aren't security companies that were started by hackers. You're probably saying, wait a minute, I've heard of these companies. So Napster was, basically shut down for copyright, facilitating copyright theft, because they were just taking CDs, ripping them, and putting them up on the internet. The guy, Sean Fanning, who started the company, went to Northeastern University. I met him, and his hacker name was Napster, and that's why he decided to start the company. Microsoft, Bill Gates, there's 2 documented hacking incidents that he got into trouble in his high school for hacking the seat assignments so that he could sit next to the girls he liked. And then he also got busted for hacking into a corporation, and he lost his computer privileges for a year. But he was so young that he didn't actually, it wasn't actually criminal. WhatsApp was actually founded by another guy from the hacking group WooWoo, Jake Koons, and WhatsApp, famous messaging software. Apple, I don't know if a lot of people know that before Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak created the Apple PC, one of their first hardware projects that they built and sold is called a Blue Box. It's a toll fraud detection device. There used to be a vulnerability in the phone system that if you played a certain tone, it would drop you into what they called a trunk line, which let you use all the operator commands and essentially make free phone calls. They sold that for a while. I guess they learned their soldering skills with that. And then if anyone's seen the movie, what is it, The Social Network, knows that Mark Zuckerberg hacked 2 Crimson reporters at Facebook, at Harvard, and I'm sure he was doing all kinds of other things, and he's still stretching the limits of privacy today. But not to condone what they did, but there's a certain mentality that goes into thinking this way, and you don't have to use that mentality to commit crime. You can do it on your own PCs, on your own networks, and that's really what I advocate, and that's what we did at the Loft. This is a picture of the Loft from the late 90s. You can see me there. I cut my hair. Trying to get a management job. And what we did was we took the concept of securing your network by breaking into it to the concept of securing your product by breaking into it. So we came up with techniques of building a lab environment where we could take a piece of software like Windows Server and figure out how to send network traffic to it, analyze it, write programs that would inject certain packets into the program, set up a debugger so we could watch the internals of the program, how it worked, instrument it, and figured out techniques for tests for vulnerabilities in software. And we got really quite good at this, such that we were putting out what we called security advisories, probably 1 a month in a major product. We found the very first vulnerability in Internet Explorer as something that was something that Microsoft took notice to, and we started to actually get into a dialogue with Microsoft, and this is where they asked us to do what they called responsible disclosure, do the responsible thing, and we'll fix the issue. And we started doing that because we didn't want to put people at risk. The only reason we were publishing this stuff is because we didn't think they were going to take action. We wanted them to fix the vulnerabilities, and that ended up evolving over time. And I think probably 99% of vulnerabilities are responsibly or disclosed or coordinated disclosure with vendors these days. There's still outliers, but it's a pretty standard thing that vulnerability researchers do, and vendors respond to. And then around 2000, this is when I say hackers went legit. We joined up with a company called At Stake, and instead of doing this as a hobby, like having IT jobs or being a network security person, we full-time were security consultants helping companies learn how to build secure products and secure their networks. And we got so good at that then we got hired by Microsoft. So this was something that after sort of being the adversary, I feel like we kind of won the battle. And they said, "Okay, guys, come help us. Come help us build secure software. We don't want you just reporting vulnerabilities to us. Teach our developers how to do this." So while we were working as consultants for At Stake, we got hired by Microsoft, and these are some of the things that we taught them. We taught them how to threat model, like how do you figure out where your security controls are missing in your software, right? How do you understand how an attacker is going to attack your software? How to do advanced exploitation, heap overflow exploitation. And by teaching them that, eventually they built in mitigations for that. ALSR is a mitigation that's in Windows now because they actually learned how heap overflows worked, and they were able to do that. We built the very first fuzzer that I know of that was available outside of 3-letter agencies called Spike. And we built it on the project, and we fuzzed their software, but then we actually released it as open source. So that's where the very first fuzzer came from. We taught them how to use tools, debugging tools like Process Explorer, so they could understand how the internals of their program worked, understand the attack surface of the software. This is all things that engineers just didn't know how to do. Like people building products didn't know how to do any of these things. No wonder the software was insecure. But this is probably the thing I'm most proud of, is because we taught Microsoft these things. Microsoft wrote a book called the Microsoft SDLC with all the things we taught them and other things that they learned from other people and things they came up with themselves. And it became the reference standard for people building software. And then Microsoft actually worked with the ISO organization to make it an ISO standard. So the kind of work that we were doing actually ended up as an ISO standard. So then I said, so that's when I think the modern era sort of security started, around 2003. Manual penetration testing became a standard thing that you did. 10 years after Farmer and Venomous paper, it became something that became a standard. Companies have a product security response team so that they will listen to vulnerability researchers and take them seriously. And now people developing software actually use hacker techniques during the software creation process, or hopefully earlier, but at least at the end, to find the vulnerabilities before they ship their software. And then later, the concept of a bug bounty was formed, so people could actually make money by reporting vulnerabilities to software vendors and other organizations. So, but that sort of, we've come to a point where I think we've sort of exhausted sort of the hacker adversarial model, right? I think it's made a huge difference, but I think we still need to do better. We still can go beyond that. And what I think the next phase that has to happen is, I call it shifting left, is getting those security researchers to not work on products at the end, but work on products at the beginning. Actually have people that have reverse engineering talent, who understand how to find vulnerabilities, work side by side with the designers of software as they're building it, to bake in hardened software from the very beginning. And this is starting to happen at your more advanced organizations like Google. Mudge from the Loft works at Stripe that makes payment processing systems, and he does security engineering. He leads the security engineering team there to work alongside the developers, and as they're building these software and hardware systems, that they're built with the hacker mindset right from the very beginning. You might have heard the name Dino Daizovi. He's a famous Mac and iPhone hacker. He works at the company Square, which also does payment systems, surprisingly enough. And they're taking the same approach of using security engineers while the software is built. So that's really baking it in. And I'm advocating with my customers the concept of a security champion, where you take someone and you train them to have security awareness. Perhaps they're not going to be the best pen tester in the world. Perhaps they're not going to be a vulnerability researcher. But they have enough training, and they work on the development team. We call them security champions, someone who understands the tools, understands the different classes of vulnerabilities, and can be there while software is being built. Because there's just not enough talent to go around. We heard that there's 33,000 plus cybersecurity jobs open in Virginia alone. So I think part of the solution is training the people who are building the software, the developers and the QA people, the testers, to do this. So move security from operations and move some of it into development. And then finally, I think that when we think of building security tools, we don't just build security tools for other security people, right? Just don't build assessment tools for other security people. Build tools for developers to use, build tools for your average IT administrator to use, build tools for your average person to understand the security of their system or to protect themselves. Things like 1Password, right? Password managers for regular people to use. What we're doing at Veracode is we don't build application security testing for other security people, we build it with the idea that the developer is going to actually use that. And then you don't need as many trained cyber experts because there frankly aren't enough to go around. So we need a huge number, but we also need to upskill people who are in the software development world. So on that note, I'm going to end it, and there's my contact information. Feel free to contact me on Twitter or by email. And I think we're going to take a few questions if anyone has any. Anyone have a question?
Hi.
Hi.
I'm from University of Virginia. So are you helping in any way to improve laws and security for people who do disclose vulnerabilities? Because it's still sometimes unsafe to, if you find a bug, to then report it to a company and then they actually end up saying, no, you're at fault. Yeah.
Right. So when it's a software that is, we call on-premise, right? You install it on your computer or it's on your mobile phone. That's pretty much always going to be legal. It's your own device. The problem is that method of software is going away, and we're using more and more software online, right? So we're connecting to a website, or if we're using the mobile app, it's just a UI, and it's talking to something on the cloud, or you have an IoT device, it's talking to the cloud, right? So the problem is, to find vulnerabilities now, you have to touch other people's systems. And that's where the problem is starting to happen. The only law that we really have around this is called the CFAA, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act from 1986. It didn't contemplate any of this stuff. So that's something which I think needs to be reformed. So if you're doing, good faith security testing and you happen to touch someone else's system, that's not a crime and you can report it. Most vendors will take those reports, but the risk is, well, what if they say, hey, you touched my system and I'm going to charge you with a crime? So that's something I think that needs improvement, because as everything becomes moving to the cloud, we're not going to be able to find vulnerabilities in an independent third-party way. So I do talk with people around reforming the CFAA. Any other questions?
Hi, so I go to Virginia Tech, and kind of a follow-on to the previous question. Since you come from more of a hacker and technical background, do you think it's beneficial for people with a hacker mindset or who come from a more technical background to start taking on more policy-making roles and just take on congressional issues? Do you think it'd be more beneficial if someone in that kind of role also comes from a technical background?
Absolutely, absolutely. It really pains me when we see people having leadership roles in policy-making organizations that don't have a technical background. Can you imagine a surgeon general who wasn't an MD, right? That would be ridiculous, right? Because there's a lot of details and there's a lot of experience that should go into these decision-making processes. So I think that if that's an area that you wanna strive towards working for, coming from a technical background, I think more people with that kind of background are needed there.
So what is your advice to students who would like to follow in not your footsteps, but in a similar aspect of that? You know what I mean?
Sure. So, I look back on the things that I did, and I think, when I make recommendations to people who want a career in cybersecurity, I always say, learn the fundamentals, right? Because it's really interdisciplinary. You kind of have to know something about applications. You have to know something about operating systems. You have to know something about cryptography. You have to know something about networking. So I got my degree in computer engineering which was some hardware, but mostly software. And so I was a programmer, and that was my first job, one of my first jobs, but I didn't learn things like cryptography. I didn't learn networking. So I studied those things. I learned operating systems by installing Linux and running a web server and getting it to work, right? And getting networking to work by trying to route a Class C over a, you know, at the time it was probably don't even know what this is. It's an ISDN connection, right? It's basically a fancy dial-up modem. But like, you know, learn by doing, right? Try to build a system and just learn the foundations of, you know, how do you administer a multi-user operating system? How do you install software, keep it patched, keep it configured, harden that system? That's really important. But also like build a web app, right? Whether it's in Node.js or PHP, you know, build a simple web app to try to understand that, because there's so much now has moved to the web as far as interactivity between systems. So that's what I say is learn the foundations, and then, you know, things will come easier after that. Maybe one more question? Back there?
So I would like your opinion about moving target defense. I recently read that it might not be as effective as we think it is. So what's your opinion on that?
So what do you mean by moving target defense? I know the generality of it, but.
Well, so instead of, for example, running the software on one machine,
Yep.
it hops on another machine, or it changes over time, multiple versions.
So I think that's a good idea. You know, you could think of that as an anti-exploitation concept, right? And all anti-exploitation concepts are good. They're always going to have weaknesses. Nothing is going to be a silver bullet, but it's raising the bar against the attacker. It's making the attacker work harder, work longer, and all those things make it easier to detect them. So yeah, I think that's a good idea. You know, of course, nothing is a silver bullet. Someone's going to pull that moving defense software apart, and they're going to understand the weaknesses to it. They're going to understand how to get around it, or raise their percentage likelihood that their attack will succeed. So just be ready for that when that happens. We had one in the back.
Yeah, so just, you know, seeing you guys in your friend group and kind of seeing the beginning of things, and I was reading Frack and Iron Geek and all kind of the old school stuff, and I was just kind of wondering, was it always about trying to make things better for you? And if not, was there like a turning point, and what was that like, and what motivated that?
Yeah, so I would say that in the beginning, it was just pure hobby, pure exploration, pure trying to get understanding, trying to get things, just trying to learn, right? Just trying to learn, and it was fun. But then at some point, you know, with great power comes great responsibility sort of thing took over, and we said, you know, we need to use this power for good, right? And we started to have a consumer reports-like mentality where it was like, these people are selling broken things. We can see that they're broken, but no one else sees that they're broken. So we have an obligation to point out that, you know, essentially the emperor had no clothes. Like, the big corporation says they're doing everything security, but guess what? They're not. And we're going to prove to you, because we're going to distribute an exploit, that they're not. So that's when it kind of shifted towards a more of a consumer advocacy approach. So I guess in the beginning it was just, there was no good or bad. It was just exploring and doing, and then it shifted. So I guess that's a good way to end it. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Chris, I have something for you here, so we'll come back down.
Okay.
So Chris, some great insights about the hacker mindset, how to use that to protect ourselves, but I really appreciated your last comments about the ethical use of those responsibilities. So on behalf of the superintendent, the Corps cadets, and our staff and faculty, please accept this as a small token of our appreciation for your
Okay.
insights tonight.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Appreciate it.